Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode.
My first experience of engaging with mental health services was when I was quite young, and I did have an eating disorder at the time.
On this episode of the Level Asian podcast, we're joined by Asami Koike from Shapes and Sounds.
Even then, I felt like maybe there were things that weren't quite understood from a culturally responsive place. I don't know how things look now within that sector and that space. They weren't like, oh, you should eat your rice and natto and like grilled fish.
There's this really interesting paradox when it comes to seeking mental health services and just understanding your own identity and belonging. You can't ask your parents for help about the experiences you're going through because they don't have that lens either.
Asians aren't accessing mental health services, not because we're completely immune to mental health problems. People are struggling in silence. One of those reasons, of course, is the negative stigma that pervades mental health in Asian communities. A really big piece that people don't really talk about is the fact that mental health services, which are all umbrellaed by Western psychology, it's a very Eurocentric framework. It makes sense, like, of course, we're trying to access a service that's not actually designed for us.
This episode contains discussions around the topic of mental health, which may be heavy for some. If you or a loved one are going through a tough time, please reach out to Lifeline at 13 11 14. Asami, welcome to the Level Asian podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
How are you feeling today?
Good, I think. Like the sun's out, like better than usual. I don't really do well in winter, but I think good today.
Yeah.
If that's not a weird
It's a nice day. The sun's out. We're actually in Melbourne today recording this podcast. We're joined by Dave. For those who are listening to the audio only, we're joined by Dave, who does our newsletters for Level Asian. So you would check that out, or you would be reading that every fortnight if you're subscribed to our fortnightly newsletter. If you're not, you can find it in the show notes. But Dave is also based here in Melbourne. So we called him along, got him to co-host this podcast here with Asami today.
Hey everyone, super excited to be here.
Just in case you're not familiar with his voice. So yeah, Asami, thank you again for coming onto the podcast today. You are from Shapes and Sounds. But to kind of kick things off, what we normally do is we always ask our guests to tell us a little bit more about yourself, bring a little bit of context to the podcast. So run me through what your upbringing was like, what your childhood was like, and the whole experience.
Okay. Well, that's a great question to start with. It's like a real therapy question, so very like on brand for what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so if I start from the beginning, I was born in Japan. I moved here when I was 4 years old with my parents. And like if we rewind a few generations as well, what might be important to this conversation is that even though my family and myself, we identify 100% as Japanese, many people in our families have spent a lot of time outside of Japan. Mm-hmm. Like my mum grew up overseas. My grandfather spent a lot of time overseas as well. So we've been like quite like a globalized sort of, not just a purely Japanese family, if that makes sense. And for me, I think how that translated in my upbringing is that I grew up, like my parents left Japan essentially to kind of live a more westernized life, like which I'm very, very grateful for. I'm glad I didn't stay in Japan and live within like the rigidity of Japan. So that meant that I had the freedom to explore my passions and do a lot of art and creativity and explore lots of different things that I think a lot of other people may not have had the opportunity to. So I'm really grateful for that experience. But at the same time, I think like this experience of having parents who like were sort of deciding to leave Japan, I think at a very, very young age, I really internalized like actually the West is better than Asia. And like the more I let go of being Japanese, the better my life will be. And I think the scary part about that is it gets really reinforced through messages around us, you know, like growing up Asian in Australia, like that kind of ideal, the more you assimilate, the more you fit in, the better your life's going to be. So I really like absorbed that from a very young age, unknowingly. And I think that led me down a journey of thinking about belonging and thinking about identity and moving into more mental health fields of work as well. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, that was really, really good. Thank you for sharing that. So I guess taking us through your childhood, but then taking it through schooling as well. You went to school here, and can you tell us a little bit about that? So like primary school, high school, and then university.
Yeah. I would say I was probably one of like 3 Asians, maybe 5, in my whole junior school. And then into senior school, there were like more Asians came in. So really surrounded, like I didn't have any Asian friends. All my friends, all my neighbours, everyone was white around me as well.
Sorry, just to situate ourselves, are we based in Melbourne here? Are we based somewhere else?
Yeah, Melbourne. Everything Melbourne, actually. Yep. Until COVID hit, I really felt like Melbourne was the only thing that existed in Australia. So now I understand, like Sydney exists. Anyway, we could talk about that later. But everything in Melbourne, I grew up in like a really white suburb, really white school. And then I did go straight to uni, but I had like no idea what I was doing. So I wanted to be a musician, but I didn't really understand how to have music in your life without being either a performer or a music teacher. And I think personality-wise, neither of those really fit me. So then I decided to study science comm.
Oh, what a difference.
Like, it's just ridiculous when you look back, right? So then I dropped out, and I decided to drop out and become a yoga teacher. That's another long story embedded within that. But I moved to India, lived in India for 6 months, studied yoga in an ashram, like the proper full deal, which was incredible. Like, I'm really glad that I got to study yoga, where yoga is from, and really understand the roots of yoga as well. But then following that, instead of coming back to Melbourne, I went to Tokyo, which is where I was born. And I really tried to fit in Tokyo. I thought like I'd explored identity and belonging. And then I was like, I feel like I'm really Japanese, so let me go back to my homeland. But I never learned how to speak Japanese.
Oh, okay.
So I just like picked it up, right? So my Japanese isn't great. So then I went to Japan to teach yoga for 3 years, and that was like a really eye-opening experience, especially because Japan is such a xenophobic country. Obviously not everyone, but parts of it are very xenophobic. And it was really hard to fit in. I didn't slot back in as I had expected. And so that again perpetuated like this thinking about who am I, where do I belong, what's my identity? If I don't belong in Japan, then oh my God, what am I?
Yeah.
Eventually all this turmoil led to me coming back to Melbourne to study music, which then led me into a profession called music therapy. So I did my Masters of Music Therapy, and that's where I really entered the mental health sector. In the music therapy degree, what you do is you have to go and create a music therapy program at an organisation that doesn't have music therapy. So I went to a crisis and acute youth mental health service and set up the music therapy program there and worked with a lot of young people. And it was there that, this is where it all starts to link in, but that was where I really started to notice that there were young Asian Australians who would present to services, who would kind of engage in services and then disengage really quickly, or they wouldn't get the care that, I don't know, like something was missing. Like they would just fall through the cracks, they would just sort of disappear. And every time I would raise this to management, I'd be like, oh, I feel like the Asian kids are kind of like disappearing. The answer that I would always get back was, okay, let's get more interpreters and let's translate our documents more.
Interesting.
Right? Interesting, right? And then me being me, I was like, oh, I feel really confused because I feel like they're speaking English.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And many of them were, like many are diaspora, like second gen. So they'd been born in Australia, but then like something was missing that they would disengage from service, and everyone thought the answer was adding more language services in, which are very, very important, but definitely not the answer. And that was where I really started to think about the cultural nuances that are present in mental health, and also especially like the diaspora experience. Like I think we're really invisible. Like maybe we also, like, this is what Level Asian podcast is exploring, right? Like, what is this identity? What does it actually mean? And like, we are working that out, but everyone else also doesn't know, and that has really severe consequences when it comes to mental health care.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I feel like this generation now, because we are considered technically like first gen, because we're making waves here and building our own identity from the ground up. We don't have our parents who have already rooted themselves here. And that also means it leaves gaps within mental health. It leaves gaps within the healthcare system in general. And again, this is also why our generation needs to step in and make moves. Otherwise, who else is going to do it for us? Is especially with what Shapes and Sounds is doing. The other question before we dive into more about Shapes and Sounds and what you do, and also mental health journeys, I do want to go back to when you spoke about yoga and teaching that in Japan for 3 years. Tell us a little bit more about that journey. I know you mentioned why you did it, but maybe more in depth of why you did it. And maybe what you discovered during that time about yourself too.
I was practicing a lot of yoga just because it was like the cool thing to do at the time. So I was just doing a lot of yoga. I hated being at uni doing a degree that I had no interest in. And I actually wanted to follow this particular yoga teacher for like one of those 5-star 1-month yoga teacher training retreats in Bali. And then I told my parents, I was like, this is it. Like, this is my calling. And then they were like, okay, well, if you want to go, if you want to drop out of uni to study yoga and become a yoga teacher, do it properly, go to India. So I literally, at 19 years old, I suspect it was like, so I didn't go. But at 19 years old, I just like typed in yoga teacher training India, and I clicked the first one and I wrote to them and I went. So that's how it happened.
That's a huge step though.
It's huge, hey. I could never do that now. That's only like an idiot 19-year-old.
Yeah, but you had the blessing of being able to be, taking risks all the time.
Yeah. And I'm so glad I did. It was like an incredible experience. And then, so teaching in Tokyo, I did teach to an expat audience, so it was bilingual. I actually taught in English and Japanese, which was really fun well. It was hard. It was physically taxing. Oh, another thing I can tell you is this. I would say, like, work ethic wise, you know how we all know about the Japanese like stereotype salaryman work ethic? I would say that was very much the case for teaching yoga as well. Wow. So even in like a health and wellbeing industry, these yoga teachers, the amount of classes they taught and the dedication and like coming into Tokyo for an hour on a fully packed train teaching yoga, that was real. And I also couldn't quite keep up with that. Like, my work ethic was not quite there. That's another Japanese thing that I didn't quite adopt as well. That was really eye-opening. And I think sometimes you have to leave places to understand how much you appreciate and love your home, which I think, I don't know, I think it's Melbourne. But it really made me see like how lucky my life is here too.
Okay, so just moving on to Shapes and Sounds and how that came in. You said you came back and then you started doing a lot of work in the mental health space. The other question I have is, in our prep calls, you've mentioned in your research that Asian Australians are also most often falling through the cracks with the mental health care system. Can you give us more detail into why that is and what you discovered during this whole process, especially after you've taken it to your managers and flagged it with them? Turns into, hey, let's get more interpreters and translators, but that's obviously not the case.
So really interesting. In Australia, we make up 20% of the population, right? The Asian population makes up 18 to 20% of the Australian population. But when you look at the people accessing mental health services, only 3% are Asian, like 3 to 5% are Asian, right? So it's really disproportionate to like how many actual Asians there are in this country. But when you get to emergency services, again, that percentage lifts a little. So that means that Asians aren't accessing mental health services, not because we're completely immune to mental health problems or have like no issues that we need support with, but because that percentage increases with emergency care, it means that like people are struggling in silence. Like a lot of us are suffering and struggling in silence, and we've internalized a lot of that pain. I think one of those reasons, of course, is the negative stigma that pervades mental health in Asian communities, and the lack of understanding around mental health as well. And then also perhaps tied in with immigrant experiences of like, just keep your head down, just work and just, you know, just be quiet and keep going and grit and persevere. So I think on one hand there's that, but I think a really big piece that people don't really talk about is the fact that mental health services, which are all umbrellaed by Western psychology, like Western psychology being a very beautiful practice and a very legitimate and valid and very, very, very good practice. I'm just gonna say that. Yeah, disclaimer. But when you look at Western psychology, it's a very Eurocentric profession and a practice. It's a very Eurocentric framework and a very Eurocentric way of understanding health and happiness and relationships and love and all of that kind of stuff, right? And if you actually look at the research, it's only in the last like 10 to 15 years that people of colour have been researched amongst the so-called evidence-based literature, right? Or people of diverse genders, people like that stray from the cis middle-class white able-bodied person. So then that means that all of these evidence-based services that are on offer within mental health services, they were actually never evidence-based based upon like Asians or other people, right?
Definitely. Yeah.
So then it makes sense. Like, of course, we're trying to access a service that's not actually designed for us. It's a product that was never like product market fit, you know, like it wasn't actually made 100%. For us. And it's only very, very recently that ideas around culturally responsive mental health practice have come to the forefront of our discussions. And I would say that's what causes a lot of the discrepancy.
Yeah, even speaking from like my own mental health experiences, just as growing up as a kid, but also now, two very different experiences. We had a podcast guest on, I think, Emily Unity. Oh, yeah. So this morning, and we were talking about that and the discrepancies there. But my growing up, the nuances were that migrant family, eldest child, growing up in rural New South Wales. So there were no practitioners around there that were Asian Australian, right? And then fast forward a good few years, so maybe 1 or 2 years ago, when I was looking for a psychologist, one, I had to go to my GP, so many hoops to jump through. 2, then trying to look for an Asian Australian practitioner as well. And then 3, having to like go through like finances and then dating around quote unquote for a therapist, and them understanding your nuances and unpacking that. This is a very long-winded question. But as someone working in the mental health space yourself as well, what could government resources or other organisations do out there to help this process along? Because it is very complicated.
It is complicated, hey? I completely agree. And I mean, it's hard enough just to like book a hairdresser, right?
Absolutely.
Let alone like go through all those steps to see a therapist. What can people do, hey? I would say one, it's got to be easier. Like as ridiculous as it sounds, I didn't even know like what rebate meant, like a Medicare rebate. So I think we really need to make sure that people actually understand what's available. And a Medicare rebate being, if a psychologist costs $270, which is sort of the recommended rate, then Medicare will put towards like $120 something so that you don't have to pay the full $270 or $280, right? And everyone has access. Everyone under Medicare has access to 10 of those sessions a year, but you do have to go to your GP to get that mental health care plan, and then you do have to check in. I think like around the 6th session as well. So really like tangible steps like that are so important for people to know, right? Because when you're not feeling great, the last thing you have the energy to do is like research what is a Medicare rebate like. It's so hard.
And where to see the doctor.
Yeah, and then you have to tell the doctor, and then the doctor asks you all these questions too.
The health
questionnaire.
Questionnaire.
The K10.
The K10 healthcare plan. Like, it's just drawing from my experience. Obviously, COVID was rough. I know all Melburnians listening to this podcast can relate to trying to seek mental health services during COVID. But I remember when you finally get the confidence to go to the GP, ask, you get hit with a questionnaire about how you're feeling, how are all of these things. They print it off for you. They're like, here's your mental health care plan. Now go find someone to help out. And I think that that's already enough of a barrier to seek further. And then, like Viv mentioned, dating different psychs. It's like you go around almost shopping, right?
Yes.
It's like you have one session, you're like, okay, that went well, that didn't. And yeah, it just gets super exhausting.
Yeah. And that's when you're not feeling well as well, right? It's not like everything's great.
Absolutely.
That you barely have the energy to kind of like take care of yourself. But then there are all these things that you have to do. It's really, really hard. And I would say the K10 is quite an intense questionnaire as well.
It's quite invasive.
Like all of a sudden.
Yeah, absolutely. So then,
scary,
going back to that as well, then, do you have anything that you can see in the space that would improve this system that you could recommend? Or I guess what could you see could be done to be better for people in like, say, this process or the system itself?
I think knowing what all those steps involved are would be really helpful. Like, imagine if you actually knew what that questionnaire would ask, then you're kind of prepared for it when they ask you really intense questions about self-harm or so then you're like, oh, okay, you know what's coming. I think stigma is so interlinked with fear, and fear is so closely interlinked to not knowing, right? So the more we can just say, this is what happens, this is what they're going to ask you, then you have to do this. As ridiculous as that sounds, I think that process is really important. We have an infographic as well, if you're interested, like, and we listed it. It took me so long because I was like, this is very complicated, and that's coming from someone within the sector as well. And another thing I should add here is, like, these conversations are great because it's really important to remind everyone that it is quite a convoluted process, and that, like, you both have gone through it, I've gone through it, and it is manageable, but it's nice to know that you're not the only person that finds it hard, because when you're feeling really low and then it's hard, then you think the problem is yours. But it's not. It's like actually quite hard.
Yeah, for sure. I also just wanted to ask, going off of that, you mentioned you've also gone through the mental health healthcare system itself. If you're open to it, would you be okay to share your story with mental health and how that's affected what you do and motivated the work that you do with Shapes and Sounds?
I would say I've always been, from a young age, maybe because I've been drawn to, like, the creative side of life. I think I've always felt a lot of things very deeply, and I've always like been very, like, overly reflective and deeply, like, just in my head a little bit too much and feeling things really intensely. My first experience of engaging with mental health services was when I was quite young, and I did have an eating disorder at the time. And it was much easier because then your parents navigate it for you, which is fantastic. This is why, like, parents are amazing. Even then, I felt like maybe there were things that weren't quite understood from a culturally responsive place. Like, obviously, if it's around eating, it's around food. And then in terms of, like, nutrition, like, I don't know how things look now within that sector and that space, but I would say the advice around, like, how to refeed yourself and how to nourish your body, that wasn't very culturally responsive. They weren't like, oh, you should eat your rice and natto and, like, grilled fish, you know? Whereas, like, that was probably what my body had grown up on, and having that kind of, like, trying to be like, oh, what are oats?
Yeah.
I've never eaten oats. I don't know if you eat oats, but
I don't eat oats. Sorry. But
I'd never eaten oats, but apparently that's, like, the healthiest thing in the world. You know, so many cultural nuances. I didn't have the language for that. Another point in which I really, really needed mental health services was after working in crisis and the acute mental health services. I definitely burnt out and I had to find a practitioner. Oh, this is an interesting story, actually. So there's a therapeutic process called EMDR, and it's a really, really interesting framework or modality, I should say, especially around, like, trauma processing. And there's this one thing, And it's not just in EMDR, but in other places, like you kind of, there's a wheel of emotions around how to describe what you're going
I know what
through,
you're talking
right?
about.
And in the middle, it's like really basic, like angry, happy, sad.
Yeah.
And then it gets more and more nuanced. So then you can kind of work out what it is that you're feeling, and that's really powerful. But I specifically remember in this thing that I was doing with the therapist, she was like, okay, you got to pick the word. And then I was like, oh, what I feel is a Japanese word. And she was really flustered. And she was like, oh, well, I mean, it could be Japanese, but, you know, like,
what's the English one right here?
What's the one on the wheel?
Far out.
And then I was like, oh, okay, this word.
It's almost like you want to give up at that point, right? Like, how can you explain something that has so many layers to it?
Exactly. And you know those words that cannot be translated, and sometimes it's like, that's the feeling. There is no other feeling.
Yeah,
that is what
for
I
sure.
feel. I think like a culturally responsive response, response, that sounds weird. Yeah. I think would have been more like, well, you know, like, let's explore that, or tell me more about what that means.
Yes.
What does that word mean? Like, I want to understand.
Describe it.
Yeah, describe it. But it was just the way that she was so flustered and like, oh my God, like another language. And I did disengage from that service.
As you should, yeah, of course you would.
Like, nah, I'm not really into this. And I think like that was bad, like disengaging from service, you know, I just like dropped off and just never went back. But also important to share, like as you both have said, if it doesn't feel right, like really advocate for yourself and have agency and take care of yourself and just walk away as well.
Yeah.
And find someone else.
At the end of the day, you are paying this person money. You are paying for your healthcare. You're allowed to walk away. Yeah.
There's a thing called APRA, the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Authority or Agency or something, APRA.com. And essentially all psychologists are listed there, as well as all healthcare professionals, right? Like GPs and stuff. So when you find a psychologist, you can actually look them up and make sure that they have no kind of conditions against their name or anything like that. And if you have a very, very bad experience in therapy, like quite a awful, like not like, oh, they laughed at something, but like actually serious stuff happens in therapy. If something really bad does happen, then you write to APRA, and then like that's how psychologists are bound to ethics as well, you know. So it's really important as a consumer of mental health services that you know things like this, so that you feel confident in being able to take care of yourself. You got to like look out for yourself, and you can. There's all these different ways in which professionals are regulated, which is really important.
For sure. And then I guess also those nuances of when you were doing like seeing a professional as well and seeing all those things unfold, that's obviously been able to impact the work that you do at Shapes and Sounds. So take us then through how you started Shapes and Sounds, how that got off the ground, and then we'll move into what you do today.
Okay. Shapes and Sounds emerged out of that experience of intense burnout. And what it was just a blog. It was literally just me writing stuff. And feeling really angry and like let down by systems, and feeling really scared as well. Like, oh wow, like Asian Australians are slipping through the cracks. Like that could be me, that could be anyone that I care about. It's just really not good enough, and no one's talking about it. So I was just writing a blog, putting stuff up on Instagram, and then traction was like very organic, and people were like, wow, this is interesting. And I just heard so many beautiful stories about people who've had similar experiences or have had really strange encounters in therapy that made them not go back as well. And then amongst that, the number one request or the number one question that we would always get was like, do you know an Asian therapist? That was 100%. Like that's all we got asked, right? And so then I was like, oh, maybe we should make a list. And I did that. That's how Shapes and Sounds emerged, essentially. Like we created a list of Asian Australian mental health practitioners, and now we're really growing that list, and we're building a community amongst our practitioners as well. But essentially everything that we've done has been in response to what people have asked. So that list came about because everyone wanted an Asian therapist. Another thing that we did was created kind of like a membership group. And that was because so many people would write to me being like, oh, I thought I was the only one. Isn't that wild to think about, right? In this day and age, that everyone thinks that they're alone, when actually, if only we could just open up the inbox, right, and show it
to the public. It's like a Reddit forum, right?
Everyone feels alone. And so that's why we decided to create a membership group where people kind of come in a forum style and have conversations about mental health. But, to try and be like, you are not alone. Like, number one, you're not alone. A lot of people experience this. Asia is so diverse, but there are so many similarities within our experiences regardless of the country of origin. Of course, there are nuances and differences, but maybe the greatest similarity is that we all feel alone.
Yeah.
And we can be bonded amongst that.
No, I was going to say, it's kind of funny in that sense because, again, this is another layered thing that I feel like is relevant. As Asians, we don't tend to speak up for what we want, and we don't really voice how we're feeling. Again, this leads into mental health, but if we're not speaking up or saying how we're feeling, how else do we know our friends or our peers are feeling the same way? And then we're just sitting in silence, gritting our teeth, doing the work, keeping our heads down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you think that comes from?
Parents. Generational trauma, right? Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I think that it also just reminds me back to earlier in the episode when we were just talking about the concept of like diaspora and longing, really being first gen. And I'm similar. I'm Filipino, and we moved to Melbourne when I was 2. And there's this really interesting paradox when it comes to seeking mental health services and just understanding your own identity and belonging, because you can't ask your parents for help about the experiences you're going through because they don't have that lens either. It's like, hey mom, I'm getting bullied for bringing lunch, like packed lunches to school. Can you make me a Nutella sandwich? It's one of these almost foreign things for our parents to understand. And I think that I really like the idea of vocabulary and building like an emotional vocabulary. And
100%.
If our parents, obviously incredibly hard working to get us here, and their parents came from nothing, that's a very typical Asian story. It's like, if they never had this discourse with their parents, how are they meant to have this discourse with us? As well as, I think, cutting them some slack now that I'm older, they're also navigating their own mental health. Their own mental health journey without any support, because they quite are literally across the seas from their family.
They're also in survival mode the whole time. A lot of the time, migrant parents, they come here, they're just trying to build a life for themselves, for their future children or their current children. All they can think about is, how can we get food on the table? How can we live through this next day? How do I navigate this space where it's a foreign language? And all of that coupled together does create trauma. And then how do they deal with that too? Gets projected onto children a lot of the time, and they can't help that.
Yeah.
But then it's up to us now to kind of work through that, because we do have the resources and the privilege of being able to understand the language that we've grown up in.
Yeah, 100%. Hey.
This episode is sponsored by Mill on Wines. Mill on Wines are an award-winning family-owned winery located in the renowned wine regions of Barossa Valley, Eden Valley and Clare Valley, presenting a fusion of vineyards that seamlessly infuse new technologies with old world traditions. Their vineyards capture the essence of each region, delivering distinctive wines with complex flavour profiles in small batches, a minimalistic approach that allows the fruit to speak for itself. Explore their range at www.millonwines.com.au. Now, back onto the episode.
I have a tangential question, but I think that maybe this is me trauma dumping onto the couch and everyone on the pod. But I think one of the hardest notions growing up as an Asian Australian was the idea of being the, I guess, living and physical embodiment of the sacrifices of our parents.
Yes.
And so how, like, every day, if I'm not doing all these amazing, incredible things, like, my parents have given me everything for me to, I don't know, I played a lot of video games growing up. It was like a both guilty pleasure as well as, I guess, an escape mechanism.
Yeah.
But that was almost the paradox. That was the dilemma that I faced every day. It's like how do you deal with the weight of both the world, navigating your identity, and just the pressure from generation, like being the first in your family's generation to be able to do all these amazing, incredible things, right? Like your parents tell you all about the sacrifices that they made, but
what are you supposed to do with that? Because you carry the weight of their world on your shoulders.
Yeah.
Would love to hear your thoughts.
Let me let that land. Yeah. That's a huge question and something that so many of us are thinking all the time, and maybe not even thinking, like viscerally feeling, right?
I live through that every day. Like while you have a moment to think, I can totally relate to that. Maybe because my experience in itself, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, eldest daughter, my dad is very traditional, but he's come here and brought our family together essentially. And like, he still works 7 days a week, every single day. He only gets 2 days off a year. And even still, those 2 days off a year, he spends it working, doing something in the garden. I don't know what it is, but he doesn't know what to do with himself besides to work.
Yeah, wow.
And so then I guess the impact of the kids is like, if we go out one night, we feel guilty because we're spending time with our friends and not working. But I think my siblings are learning to have a bit more fun and have a bit more freedom with their life, but I'm still learning to navigate how can I have a life without tying my identity to work all the time, because that's all I know, that's all I've grown up with, and that's all I've seen my parents do.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, we just made this session about it.
No, tell me. She's my job. Yeah. No, I think it's such an important question. Okay, so let's like unpack it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we?
Unpack.
Oh shit.
Okay, get ready, everyone. So I think first and foremost, right? Like there are things within your control, and then there are things outside of your control. And the things within your control have a lot to do with like how you respond to different situations, right? So that doesn't negate the reality of all the pressures that you face or that many people face. It doesn't mean that like, oh, I can ignore that or that doesn't exist. But how you choose to respond to that can greatly differ. So something like the experience of guilt is really interesting to explore, because like, what is guilt, right? Like, I used to always say like, oh, I feel so guilty. And then someone told me like, but why? And then I was like, oh yeah, why? Like, I don't mean to make this lighthearted or in any way, but it's just really interesting to consider like, why do I feel guilty? Where does that come from? And like, is that something that I want to choose to feel, or is it something that I'm like, my body is just so used to feeling, and my neural pathways are just always like, this is just how I respond to things. Or do I want to give it a go to be like, to try something else, to feel a different way? And it's important to remember that whenever you try something new, that's really uncomfortable. Like the human body doesn't like novel things because that could be dangerous, right? So if your whole life you felt this sense of guilt and pressure, then it's really hard to choose to feel like, oh, I have all this pressure. And do you know what? I'm honored by the power of my ancestry, like pushing through my veins, and I'm going to celebrate my life right now. Like we could do that, but we don't, because it's very, very hard to do so, right? But that's something to think about. Like, what am I in control of? Like, what do I have choice in how I approach this situation, right? At the same time, I don't know what my parents think, but I can't speak for them. But I suspect, I don't know, maybe I'm just hypothetically, I suspect that they really, really want me to be well and to be happy and healthy. I suspect, right? Like there might be a lot of other stuff intertwined within that. But I feel like when I think about my parents and my grandparents, and I'm an only child as well, so it's just like, it's only me.
That's a lot of pressure.
Sorry, everyone. To all my ancestors. And on one side, I'm like the only grandchild as well. So
that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pressure, hey? But I think like I actually just try to think like, thank you so much for everything that you've brought me, and now I get to live this really full life where I feel joy, and I feel like I've got so much space to take care of myself, and like I get to do really amazing things, like thanks to you. And I try not to crumble under the pressure.
Although that's what you've been conditioned to believe, but it's also just a mindset shift and being able to see a different perspective on life. And I think it is quite freeing. Like, thank you for sharing that, because I don't know if you feel the same way, but once you shift the mindset, obviously it's very uncomfortable and it takes a lot of time to do so, but doing those little habits, changing those little mindset things of when you do feel guilty, taking a moment just to reflect, hey, why do I feel this way? Can I change how I feel? And slowly reteaching your brain how to respond to these situations is going to be really impactful. And also the weight off your shoulders starts becoming lighter and lighter, because at the end of the day, you're not living for your parents, you're living for yourself. Your parents exist within your life, but you're still living your own at the end of the day.
And it's important as well, like as you make those shifts, that you have people around you that are also on some kind of a similar journey, or at least understand that as well. You know, it's really hard to be surrounded by people who have no understanding about family pressure, and then say, listen, I'm really trying to rewire my brain over here. Like, people will be like, what are you doing? Just set clear boundaries.
Just say no.
Just say no. You're like, I'm trying. So it's important that you have community and that you are connected to people. And for many people in the Asian diaspora, I think it means coming back to the community and really trying to find safety. I think many people have left because they didn't feel safe, but it is through conversations like this, through platforms like yours and Shapes and Sounds, that there are spaces in which people are trying to find their identity again, and we can connect. And I would say things like subtle Asian traits was like our first entry point, right? So funny. And like, I think that was a really good entry point, but now it becomes almost like very stereotypical and a little bit too like, I don't know, like there's only one way to be Asian or Asian American or Asian Australian, right? But now we're having much more nuanced conversations where diversity exists within our experiences, but there are very deep shared experiences that we can kind of support each other on in our experience of growth.
I want to take a slightly different direction with this. I am a little bit curious to hear your thoughts on this, but what I've noticed recently, or as we are starting to have more of these conversations, we do sometimes have to go onto one extreme to be able to bring in like a safety net for other people. So when we talk about mental health and having these conversations around mental health, I do feel like younger generations aren't being taken seriously, or we are being taken almost as though we are too sensitive when it comes to mental health, because it wasn't talked about in Asian Australian conversations and just vernacular as well. Just, I don't know your thoughts either, but yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on just what you think about that, what we can do about it, and are we taking younger people a bit more seriously, or just people in general who are talking about mental health seriously?
Yeah. Okay, that's such a good question. And I want to start by saying, like, when we say the word mental health as well, it's such a huge spectrum, right? So on one end, you've got people living with severe and acute mental illness that really need a lot of supports. Otherwise, they cannot function safely in the world. And all the way to the other end of the spectrum of like, I feel burnt out, I feel stressed. And then there's so many points in between. So I think when it comes to the conversations around mental health, often we're very binary as well. It's either like we're talking about mental illness, or we're talking about like, oh, you're too sensitive, right? So I think there's a reaction within that as well. Like, things are just a bit too binary. So one, understanding that mental health is this huge spectrum. But two, when it comes to younger people, and I would say when it comes to anyone, like if you just open your eyes or like look at the news for a second, like it's just chaos, right?
It's absolute mess.
It is like so chaotic. And we're all like, oh my God, I got to get my business going. When like literally the world is ending, right? Very existential, very hopeful. But I think that's another issue as well. When we have mental health conversations, we feel like the problems and the solutions only exist within us. When actually we're having a very normal reaction to a very abnormal situation, like the climate is out of control, like neo-Nazis in Melbourne, just like everything, right? Like AI is taking over the world, like what's happening with China and Taiwan, like everything, and Trump. Of course people feel distressed, and I would say like it would be strange if you were doing well in this time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost like when you take a step back at it and you look at some of like younger generations, you're like, why are they so miserable? It really is like, look outside.
Absolutely.
Like, look at the world that they inherited and look at the circumstances that they have to go through. The impact of social media, on the developing brain, and just, people not listening to us.
It was interesting because just before this podcast, we were walking back to the apartment here and we were having a conversation, slightly different tangent, but it's Gen Z's, the interest rate rises, cost of living crisis. Yeah. Exactly.
We're broke too.
Yeah. And we were just talking about like, I don't know how old you are.
I'm 37.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, what? Asian to raisin. God damn. Wow.
Yeah. I'm definitely not Gen Z.
Holy shit.
But I appreciate young people.
So young. You look incredibly young.
Thank you.
We were talking about how the older generations seem to be a little bit more comfortable with this cost of living crisis. We could just be generalizing, but overall, it does feel like there's a lot of pressure on Gen Zs, maybe because we aren't having as many of these conversations, or it feels like we just keep being pressed down or not listened to. I don't know, maybe your take on it, being from a slightly older generation as well. Do you feel these same impacts, or do you think there's a different sense of urgency or just different sense of like crises coming from the younger generations, especially Gen Zs?
Like around the cost of living crisis?
Cost of living, but also just the impacts of everything happening in the world right now. Because the way that I see it is, say for example, the climate strikes and the school strikes. A lot of us all did those because these issues affect our generation, our kids, if we have kids, or say our siblings, or those younger. Anything that gets made into it, say like a new policy comes out and no one's taking the climate change seriously, whatever happens in that moment will trickle on and affect the whole generation that's to come.
Okay, my thoughts are like, I feel like everything is like crumbling. Okay. Like we're on the verge.
Same.
Like everything's fine, but literally the dog with the flames.
Fire,
yeah, that's how I feel. A lot of systems don't work anymore, right? So you know how they're like, what is it? Raising interest rates to curb inflation, but it doesn't work. It's like everything is broken. So within that, like I would say the hope lies in like when things are crumbling, when everything is ending, that means that only new things can emerge, right? Like innovation, creativity, that is the time when that emerges. And there has to be that, like that's probably the hope that I hold on to. That's probably what drives me to create something like Shapes and Sounds too, that I envision a world that is different. Like I would say some of those structures that are crumbling should go away so that people of the diaspora, people of colour, or now people are saying like people of the global majority, right? Rather than like marginalised people, like that, there is a shift coming, and I think like we can step into that as well, and imagine a different world and act towards a different world. And I should also add like culturally responsive practice in mental health, trauma-informed practice in mental health. All of these frameworks around mental health are like looking at systems like this. So when you focus only within the individual, that you alone have symptoms that you need to fix through like thinking differently, that's like a very old style of mental health care. But progressive forms of mental health care are looking at the systems, and when you look at the system, everything is breaking. No wonder you feel awful. No wonder you can't go to work today. And then that allows us to approach our mental health care from a much more compassionate place as well. Like to be like, oh, it is really hard. And that's your baseline to start, rather than I'm failing and I need to fix myself.
Definitely. It's like a work in progress. It's always like, also like when we were talking in our prep call, it doesn't matter if you're going to therapy to a point where you only have good things to share. Yeah. And that should be how it is. Like, it is a progressive thing that you continue on. That's something that you add into your life if you have the resources and the means to do so.
Yep.
But therapy isn't about always talking about things, bad things, and where you feel like you're going wrong or where you might not be feeling good. It's also to celebrate all the good things happening in your life and be able to understand how to process that too. Just going off about what you just mentioned about, the future of things, what does the future of Shapes and Sounds look like?
The way in which I really want Shapes and Sounds to go, right, is I think one, we've sort of discussed how maybe very, very traditional Western psychology models, they don't understand the Asian experience. But often people kind of go from that advocacy route of no, listen to us. No, listen, help us. But I personally feel like that's a really taxing approach to change very, very archaic systems. Instead, what I really want Shapes and Sounds to do, our mission is to destigmatize mental health in Asian communities, is for us to continually create resources and programs that people can engage in, and they start to learn about mental health. They start to have a language around taking care of themselves. They start to have the ability to go to a therapist and be like, are you a culturally responsive therapist, right? And actually ask that, do you know what it's like to be Asian? Do you actually understand Asian values? And I think that through Shapes and Sounds, I really want to resource the Asian Australian population to feel so comfortable that that's just your first question that you ask when you call up a therapist, right? And through that, we're a huge part of the Australian demographic. Sometimes when you change demand, that's when systems change, right? People will be like, oh no, I have no choice but to take care of the Asians. Oh no.
Maybe I should ask, describe what that means, how you're feeling.
Exactly, right? Otherwise you're going to lose 20% of your business from here on. So I feel like I don't consider myself a disruptor in any way, but I think that's the kind of approach of disruption that we take, resource so many people that you cannot ignore us anymore.
Do you have any other questions to add?
No, I just think that's really beautiful. Where was that when we were growing up?
I know.
Oh yeah, me too. It might have been decades ago.
I guess what kind of advice would you be able to give to younger generations out there, or even our audience listening, who might be looking to pursue something similar to you, or it depends on how you want to take this question, looking to find more resources, whether or not it's through Shapes and Sounds or other resources as well, in terms of looking after themselves, looking after their mental health?
I would say, just say to lead an impact-driven organisation like Shapes and Sounds, I would say my number one advice, actually for anyone, is definitely invest in taking care of your mental health. And I would say your first step is really about being curious about yourself and asking yourself, what's important to me? What are my values? Who am I? What do I like? What do I not like? And really, really spending time in that. That could be done with a therapist, that could be yourself, because then the choices that you make going forward become really seamless as well. You could have all the so-called successes on paper, but you wouldn't feel it, right? Unless it really aligns to who you are and what you want. So definitely invest in learning about yourself, then invest in taking care of your mental health, actually learning emotional regulation, actually learning how to ride the ups and downs, how to, just nourish yourself so that whatever you find yourself in, that one, you can find joy within that, but you actually have the stamina and that foundation to actually do it, right? And that would be across any kind of sector, I would say. That's everyone, right? And then in terms of taking care of your mental health, definitely come and visit us at Shapes and Sounds. You can find us hopefully on the internet. You'll find the Asian Australian Mental Health Practitioner list. We've got lots of different guides about how to access your Medicare rebate like we discussed. Even things like common questions that people ask about therapy, we've created guides around that just to help people feel comfortable and ready to step into taking care of their mental health. For us, we see that step one, get to therapy. That's really key. You don't have to be super unwell, like we said, but get to therapy, get that individualized care. And then from there, we see like 2 more steps in taking care of your mental health. One is connecting with community, like we discussed. That could be the Asian Australian community, but other communities that you feel a part of or that really celebrate your identity. And then from there, it is about being creative. Oh, so we're going full circle, right? Back to the creativity conversation. But I think it's like allow yourself to experience creativity, not just in art and music, but in thinking about new and innovative solutions to whatever it is that you're going through. And engaging in creativity just like opens your brain up, opens like you up in allowing you to kind of live really fully as well. And then know that it's like a process that you might be like 1, 3, 1, 2.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful to share. We'll leave the show notes in the show note links, Shapes and Sounds. But if people wanted to reach out to you or learn more about Shapes and Sounds, where can they find you?
I would say Instagram at Just Shapes and Sounds. So just put the just in there as well. And same on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Incredible.
Please.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Asami, and sharing lots of good laughs, but also a lot of great advice.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.